Great, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I hope you're enjoying World Trade Day here. Big event for us here in Denver, and certainly a big part of what's happening in our community is international. And it's a pleasure for me to be here to talk to you a bit about Denver International Airport and all that we're doing to help connect this city, this region, this state, this whole area of the country more globally. Just a quick introduction of who I am. I am Patrick Heck. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Denver International Airport. My responsibility basically falls into two areas. The revenue, so try to generate more revenue at the airport, particularly revenue from non-airline sources, so all the fees you pay in parking and when you eat at our concessions and so on, that falls under me, as well as our airline relationships, which includes our air service development, which is, I have to admit, one of the more fun parts of the job of working at the airport is going out and trying to convince new airlines to fly here, because it's such a great region, such a great airport to sell. So let me just give you a bit of perspective. I've got one slide today to show you, and this slide is mostly for reference to show you our network of cities out of Denver. It's a very big network. I'm not going to reference it much, but I'm just going to leave it up there for you to see as I go through. So let me give you a bit of historical perspective. For those of you who have been around Denver for a while, you might be surprised to remember that the airport is now 23 years old. We turned 23 years old actually back in February, so we opened in 1995. And in 2017, so last year, we served over 61 million passengers that came through our doors, surpassing the 60 million passenger mark for the first time ever in Denver aviation history, going all the way back to when Stapleton was open. We are ranked as the 5th busiest airport in North America and the 20th busiest airport in the world, so a very significant size for this region. Through the first quarter of this year, our traffic is up more than 3%, so we're on track for another record year, which is great news for all of us. So I want to take you back for just a minute and kind of look back about 10 years. And you think about 10 years ago, we were just starting to see some of the first signs of the Great Recession. And then our travel demand at the airport, as a result, declined between 2008 and 2009. And it was one of the few declines that we've actually seen in the history of the airport being open. Our demand in that year reached a slightly over 2 million passengers internationally, which was the low point that we've seen for international traffic over the past decade. So now fast forward quickly to 2017, and you can see that our demand last year was more than 3 million international passengers. So in 8 short years, we went from 2 million to 3 million, so an increase of over 56% in an 8-year period of time. I think it's a reflection of what we've all seen happening here in the region, but also a reflection of what's happened in the airline industry as airlines are looking for more places to serve internationally. If you look actually even over the past 5 years, that's when most of the growth has actually happened. Our growth rate at Denver has been more than double the growth rate of overall US international passenger demand since 2013. So we have been far outpacing the industry. This trend of outpacing US growth is something that's dominated Denver headlines for the past couple of years. We have seen it, you've seen it, we've all talked about it. And it's kind of across the whole region, whether it be population growth, millennials coming in here, economic development, new corporate investment, tourism, of course, our international flights. We're seeing across the board that we are outpacing growth in the US. And almost every metric I can think of, Denver and Colorado are standout performers. And that means really, really good things for our airport. So 2017, 2018 air service growth. This past year was absolutely remarkable, extraordinary as to what we saw for international growth. Unprecedented, I would say, in terms of what we saw. We had 4 new international carriers start service at Denver Airport this year. Norwegian started service to London, Gatwick, which was a new airport for us, not a new city, but a new airport, as well as Paris, which they just started recently, which I actually have the socks on here to commemorate that flight, which was great. We had Copa starting service to Panama City, getting us connected into the South American region very well. WestJet giving us more service into Calgary and into Canada. And if you haven't been on WestJet, what an amazing airline they are with great service. And here in just a couple of weeks, Edelweiss Airlines will be starting nonstop service to Zurich. So that's a fairly significant growth to have 4 new international carriers actually launch service. And that's what's important. These are new carriers to Denver Airport. These aren't existing carriers increasing their service. But in addition, we had existing carriers expanding their service as well. United started service to London this summer, and hopefully some of you had a chance to take it. It was one of our most requested services to have United actually start service into London. They did start that. We had Air Canada start service into Vancouver as well, and we had a lot more cities added in Mexico, including Cozumel and Mazatlan. And that's just international growth. So the smallest part of our overall traffic pattern is international. And when you look at it and look at the domestic side of things, the numbers get even more amazing. So I want to take 1 minute and focus, maybe more than a minute, a couple minutes, focus on domestic growth as well. And this is important because the domestic growth that we've experienced, that network you see that connects to all corners of our country, is what really fuels our international growth. There's very few international markets that can actually support nonstop service from Denver to that market because there's so many people traveling, say, from Denver to, let's say, Frankfurt, for example. So we have to have connectivity. We have to have people who fly from Durango and connect onto that flight to make that flight actually work. So this connectivity, the domestic side of it, is really important. I mentioned earlier that our annual demand for international travel is 3 million passengers per year. So that's how many people are traveling internationally. For the case of domestic travel, it's almost 10 times that number. Again, a very large number of people that are traveling domestically. So our domestic demand reached nearly 35 million passengers in 2017. So a lot of people going to a lot of places. And fortunately, with that network, you can get a lot of places nonstop without having to actually connect somewhere else, which is a great thing for customers in this region. So in addition to that demand to and from Denver, we rely on those domestic passengers using Denver as a connecting point to fill flights and board flights to international destinations. These passengers fill up the airplanes traveling to places like Tokyo and Frankfurt and Panama. So just to give you an idea, that how many of you, if you've ever flown Lufthansa to Frankfurt, big 747, a plane that's got 300, almost 400 seats on it, that plane, only 10 to 15% of the people on that plane are actually starting in Denver and ending in Frankfurt. The other 85 to 90% are all connecting somewhere beyond Denver, beyond Frankfurt, behind Frankfurt, wherever it happens to be. So it's really important that because we can't support that kind of plane flying to Denver, Frankfurt just with the local traffic, we have to have that connectivity. And that's why I spend so much time, my staff, there's a number of them here in the room. I think I saw Stephanie, Ben, Laura, who are all here, you can wave to them, do so much great work to try to keep our domestic network as big as it can possibly be. So Denver actually boasts the third largest domestic passenger network in the US. 168 US cities are served nonstop from Denver. So that's third largest. Think about that. Denver as a city, not even remotely close to being the third largest city, is the third largest number of domestic destinations in the US. And it's one of our most significant competitive advantages when we're talking about trying to get an airline to fly to Denver as opposed to flying to another city. So we can collect all these passengers from all these cities, use them to fill our international flights, and that's a key component of our long-term international strategy. Without the domestic passengers, we'd be very limited in where we could go internationally. Maybe London with maybe a flight, but beyond that, it would be very tough to actually fill those planes. So these domestic passengers give us substantially more opportunities. And it's those opportunities that we're looking forward to. So the question was now, we've had so much success, you see that network, kind of what's next? Because we don't think we just need to stop. So you think about the success over the past year or so as a result of years and years of investment and work, some of which started back as far back as 10 years ago during the Great Recession. So these things don't just happen overnight. You have to work, the market has to develop, and we have to find the trends and find the airlines that are willing to fly it. There are airlines flying today with business models that didn't even exist 10 years ago. Norwegian Airlines, who serves Paris and London out of Denver, wasn't even an airline that was even thinking about serving the US 10 years ago. Now here they are serving a number of destinations and connecting us more globally again. So 10 years ago, we didn't have flights to Iceland. We didn't have service to Tokyo. We didn't have nearly the level of service that we have today. So you think about what's happened the past 10 years, the question I would ask if I were you is, what happens 10 years from now? When we look back to this moment now, what are we going to see in 10 years? We're building business cases at the moment, and we're talking to airlines all the time to expand our nonstop reach to some of the largest, and I would say some of the most dynamic economies in the world, because Denver is one of the most dynamic economies in the world, and we want to be connected to people who are like us. So first I would say China. China's a huge growth market. I think everyone knows that within a matter of years, I think I've seen some projections, 2022, 2023, they will likely be the largest economy in the world. So for a city that wants to be globally connected, we need to have nonstop service into China. So we're looking at China. There are things that make China difficult, but we're going to try to overcome those hurdles. There are some hurdles that are simply market demand, but there are some hurdles that are regulatory and governmental related that we're trying to work through as well. South America, a very growing region as well. Colombia and Brazil are two key places for us. What's interesting about South America is there's a substantial business demand, certainly for investment in those areas, but there's a lot of leisure demand and tourism to those areas as well. So we're looking for ways to find carriers that can serve both types of demand. Australia and the Pacific Rim. What's interesting about those markets is there's really, really strong inbound tourism to Denver from places like New Zealand and Australia, for example. And so during the ski season in particular, we're looking for carriers that might be able to serve that and bring those tourists more to Denver. Central America we've had quite a bit of success as we've seen carriers launch service into the Central American countries that are there as well. Places such as El Salvador and Guatemala would be interesting to us because Denver is home to fairly large ethnic populations of people who did live there. And when you have those large ethnic populations, that tends to drive more demand as people return home to visit family, visit relatives, whatever it happens to be. So we look for things like that as well. The Middle East and Africa, I'm sure all of you have heard about the big three Middle East carriers, Etihad, Emirates, and Qatar Airways. Dubai's become a global hub, and we certainly would like to be connected to them. And so we've been talking to those carriers. It's simply a matter of demand and the right aircraft to make that actually work. So we're hopeful in the next 5 years or so that market may actually start to grow. Ethiopia, interestingly enough, is emerging as a key airline hub in Africa. They have a strong national carrier, Ethiopian Airways, that is connected to Star Alliance, which is part of the United Alliance, which means they can connect well into United. They just started service into Chicago. So we're hopeful with our large ethnic Ethiopian population as well, there might be some connections there that we can help drive that service. Certainly additional service to Europe. We are very well served to Europe now compared to where we were, say, 5 to 10 years ago. But Europe remains our biggest international market by region. So when you look at where people are flying to and from Denver, Europe still is the biggest place. So there's a number of cities there where we don't have nonstop service where it makes sense. We are, for example, the #1 city in the country without nonstop service to Amsterdam, for example. And not to say there's many connections between us and Amsterdam. There's probably one connection that we legalized here a few years ago that connects us a little better, but we do have connections between Amsterdam that would make sense for us. But of course, as I talk about all this, those are kind of the big headline-grabbing flights, but we don't want to ignore our neighbors in Canada and Mexico. We have seen so much success from the flights that we have to Canada on both our US carriers, but also the Canadian carriers. I mentioned WestJet that just started service, but also Mexico. It's a really important source of continued growth for us, not only from a demand perspective, but also connecting passengers. There's a Mexican carrier called Volaris, for example, that just announced not too long ago a code share agreement with Frontier Airlines. And so Volaris can now connect passengers onto Frontier Airlines. And that is really helpful as we continue to try to grow this connecting hub. Those people coming through really help make that demand work and grow our international reach. So what I want to stress here as I kind of wrap this up with you is that this network is fantastic, but we can't take it for granted because for every city like Denver there are so many cities that are trying to do this exact same thing. So it's a very competitive market. Planes, by their very nature, are very mobile. They can move from place to place, so airlines don't have to put them here. And it's a big investment for airlines to have them here. So we're not the only city that's trying to do this. So we have to think about this in terms of competitiveness. Airlines have limited resources. They only have a certain number of airplanes that they have on order, and they can deploy them to a number of different places, whether it be the same plane that Lufthansa uses, say, to Munich, can go a lot of other places as well. So we're competing globally for that plane to actually come here. So we have to think a little bit about what that means. When we talk to Chinese carriers, we're competing with cities in China for that airplane. And if you think about cities in China, there are a number of cities that you and I have never even heard of that have well north of 10 million people that have growing wealth. So Chinese carriers are seeing a lot of demand domestically even that they can actually fulfill. So we have to compete with those cities to get those aircraft to come here. And then as the aircraft technology continues to evolve, just about every corner of the world is going to be reachable nonstop from Denver. Qantas Airlines just launched a flight from Perth, Australia to London. 17 hours. Imagine spending 17 hours sitting on a plane. So that pretty much says you can reach anywhere you need to go. So we have so many options available to us, and we have to leverage the assets we've got, which include this amazing facility that we all approved and built 25 years ago that really help us connect to the world. So in closing, before I open up to any questions that you all may have, is there's global competition for what it is we're trying to do here. This network, there's a lot of airports that are trying to do this exact same thing. So the good thing about where we are is we're in great position to take advantage of that. We're centrally located in the US. We have 3 very strong carriers in United, Southwest, and Frontier that operate types of hubs here. So we're positioned very well to be able to go out and grab the international traffic, but we have to take those next steps to keep us competitive. And we're reliant not just on us as an airport to do that, but us as a region keeping to make those investments that are going to keep people moving here, keep people wanting to come here. So with that, I'd love to take any questions you may have about the airport and about what's happening here in Denver. Sir.
So when you're engaging with these different airlines, how do you determine if it's going to be a domestic U.S. carrier or one of the foreign airlines that serves the route?
The biggest determination is whoever really shows the interest, to be honest with you. So we will go to our hub partners. United Airlines is a good example, and show them our demand. One thing we know is a lot of how many people are traveling, say, between Denver and, let's say, Rome, for example. So we'll talk to our domestic carriers, but a lot of it depends on where the point of sale is for that demand. Where is it that people are coming from? Is it people in Denver or people in the US locally buying tickets, flying there? That generally points it more towards a US carrier. But if it's people coming from the foreign country here, it generally points to the foreign carrier. So Edelweiss Airlines, which is starting a service here, some of you may not have ever heard of them. They're actually part of the Lufthansa group. They're owned by Swiss Airlines, which is owned by Lufthansa. They are targeted primarily at Swiss leisure travelers. So what they go after is, wealthy Swiss who want to have a nice vacation, and so that's who they are targeting, and they're trying to get them to destinations. So that flight will largely have Swiss folks on it, maybe 60 to 70%. So that's what really dictates, whether we go after international or versus a U.S. carrier. The other thing that's important is that U.S. carriers have a network already in place, and so when United, for example, they've got hubs on the West Coast that serve Asia well, hubs on the East Coast that serve Europe. Denver may not make as much sense for them given their hub network, whereas it may make tons of sense for Lufthansa to serve it because now we're just a spoke as opposed to a hub for them. So those types of things influence who we pick to go after.
It sounds exciting on the Denver International Airport because 2 years ago I had the opportunity to sit in an event where the mayor talked about the strategy on engaging other airlines to come into Denver. My question specifically is on what is your organization doing to minimize the landing fees for airplanes coming into Denver?
That's a great question. One of the things that helps airlines come here is when we keep our costs low, because it means they make more money per passenger. So we look at a metric that we call cost per enplaned passenger. It means for every passenger that gets on an airplane, how much does it cost the airline to serve our airport? We finished last year around $11.50. And just to put that in comparison, there are several other hub airports that are pushing north of $30 per passenger. So when Denver Airport opened, it was an expensive place to operate because it was an expensive airport to build. It looks like a bargain now 20 years later. And so what we do is because we're able to expand more cheaply, that means we can add gates, add capacity much more cheaply than, say, Chicago can, or say Washington Dulles or whoever it happens to be. So that's number one, is we have the land and capacity to expand cheaply. We're spending $1.5 billion, a lot of money, admittedly, but we're gonna get 39 gates out of it. LaGuardia Airport is spending $4 billion to get no new gates. That's just to redo their central terminals. So those are the kind of things that are going to keep our costs low. The second thing we do, and this is where it becomes really important as people are coming to the airport, is we find non-airline sources of revenue. That's parking. That's concessions, our land that we're starting to develop and try to put an airport city out there. We have 76 operating oil and gas wells. We have farming. We have the hotel that we own. So we look for sources of revenue that we can then use to reinvest in the airport so that the airlines don't have to make that investment themselves. And that's what keeps our costs much more competitive.
Thank you, Patrick. We have time for one more question.
So it's interesting you mentioned, for example, Ethiopian Airlines just started their flight to Chicago, and as a native Denverite, I always want Denver to be the leading edge of everything and want to be really proud of my city. So I'm just wondering, do you envision regions of the world or potential connections where Denver is the leader, where we're the first or one of the very first cities in the US to do that?
It's a great question. I think the short answer, it's hard to imagine, and I'll give you one very specific reason why, is Chicago, home to a number of global corporate headquarters, which generally have passengers that fly and pay more for their seats. They fly up front of the plane, whereas Denver just has less of that. So it's hard to imagine a place where Denver could be kind of leading edge, where we're kind of some of the first service, say, into Africa or first service into some places because of that reason. But I think as the economy is changing here, our economy is shifting a bit, and as the airline strategy is shifting somewhat, it's becoming more competitive. That does open us up to potentially be one of the kind of first movers in some of those places. So not to be the leader, but we're not now off the radar entirely. We're one of the cities that's on the list of things that they're considering. So, I mean, there's not many places in the world that are unserved now from the US. So it's hard to think about where Denver could be, but it very likely wouldn't be us being the leading edge, but we'll take whatever we get at this point, and our growing international network reflects that. So.
Thank you very much, Patrick.